Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to be doing a deep dive into a topic that's pretty heavy but super important, the mental health of Syrian refugees. And we're using a 2019 study from the Scandinavian Journal of Public Health.
Yeah, that's a systematic review, too.
Oh, that's right, which means it combines data from a bunch of different studies.
15 to be exact.
Okay, so it's giving us a pretty comprehensive look then.
It really is. It gives us insights into over 8,000 refugees. I think what's really fascinating about this review is you really get a sense of the sheer scale of this crisis.
Right, because it's easy to hear the word Syrian refugee crisis and not really grasp the numbers behind it. So can you kind of put that into perspective for us? How many people are we actually talking about here?
Well, by 2019, over 12 million Syrians had been forced to flee their homes.
Wow.
Yeah, because of the conflict. I mean, that's like imagining the entire population of, say, Belgium or Greece being uprooted and scattered.
That's just mind-boggling.
It is, and it's important to remember that that's just the starting point of their journey.
Right, because even when someone reaches relative safety, I mean, the experience of becoming a refugee is inherently traumatic, isn't it? It's not just about the initial reasons for fleeing.
Exactly. It's like imagine having to leave everything you know behind, witnessing violence, maybe even experiencing torture, losing loved ones. And then on top of all that, you face the hardships of refugee camps, the uncertainty of your future, and the massive culture shock of adapting to a completely new country.
Yeah, it's like trauma piled upon trauma. And that really comes through in the numbers from this review. They found that 43% of Syrian refugees experience PTSD. That's more than 6 times higher than what you typically see in the general population.
Yeah, it's a staggering difference. I was trying to think of a way to really make that hit home. Like imagine a typical classroom. Statistically, you'd expect maybe 3 or 4 students to have experienced PTSD at some point in their lives. But in a classroom of Syrian refugees, based on this data, that number jumps to over 20 students.
Wow. Yeah, that really puts it into perspective. And it's not just PTSD, is it? This review found high rates of other mental health challenges as well.
You're right. The review also found that 40.9% of Syrian refugees suffer from depression, and 26.6% struggle with anxiety. And what's really concerning is that many people are dealing with multiple conditions at the same time, which obviously makes recovery even harder.
Yeah, absolutely.
And tragically, there's also an elevated risk of suicide within this population.
It's heartbreaking to think about. So what's at the root of these incredibly high rates of mental health challenges? I mean, considering everything we've just talked about, did the review point to any specific factors?
Well, one key factor is what researchers call trauma dose.
Trauma dose.
Yeah, it refers to the sheer number of traumatic events a person has experienced. The studies in this review showed an average of 7.3 traumatic events per person among Syrian refugees.
7 traumatic events per person. That's hard to even fathom.
It is. To give you an idea of the types of trauma we're talking about, the study looked at events like witnessing violence and death, being threatened with violence or fearing for their own lives or the lives of loved ones. Many also experienced or witnessed torture, imprisonment, even the destruction of their homes and communities.
Right. It's really no wonder the mental health toll is so high.
It really isn't.
And it sounds like it's not just the past trauma that's affecting them either. Are there ongoing challenges in their new environments that also play a role?
Absolutely. Even after fleeing the immediate danger, refugees face a whole new set of stressors as they try to rebuild their lives. Think about the difficulties of being separated from family, the challenges of learning a new language and culture, and the discrimination many refugees encounter. All of these things contribute to the mental health burden they carry.
So it's not just about escaping the war zone. It's about navigating a whole new set of obstacles and trying to find stability and hope in a completely unfamiliar place.
Exactly. And the specific challenges can vary a lot depending on where a refugee ends up. This review actually found some interesting patterns related to the country of resettlement.
Oh, that's interesting. I imagine support systems and resources would vary quite a bit from one country to another. Did the researchers find significant differences in mental health based on where refugees were living?
They did. For instance, studies comparing refugees in Turkey versus Sweden found noticeable differences in mental health outcomes.
Yeah, that makes sense. I would think countries with more robust support systems and social safety nets would see better outcomes.
Right, and those support systems can even vary within a country. The review also looked at the difference between refugees living in camps versus those who were integrated into communities.
I can only imagine living in a camp environment would be incredibly stressful, even if it provides basic necessities.
And that's what the researchers found. Living in a refugee camp was linked to higher levels of anxiety and depression. I mean, it makes sense when you consider the often challenging and uncertain living conditions in those settings. It's hard to find stability and build a new life when you're constantly facing overcrowding, lack of privacy, and limited opportunities.
Right. It's not just about physical safety. It's about having the space and support to heal and rebuild. I'd imagine all of this affects men and women differently, too. Did the review look into any gender disparities and how mental health is impacted?
Yes, it did. It highlighted some important nuances. While the findings were mixed across studies, some indicated that women were more likely to experience PTSD than men. And importantly, the types of trauma experienced also differed by gender.
So trauma isn't a one-size-fits-all experience. It manifests differently based on someone's life experiences and identity.
Exactly. For example, men were more likely to report combat-related trauma, while women were more likely to report what's called collective identity trauma.
Collective identity trauma. I'm not familiar with that term. What does
Yeah.
that mean?
Sure. Imagine being targeted not just as an individual, but as a member of a particular group. Maybe you're threatened or attacked because of your religion, ethnicity, or political beliefs. That constant fear and sense of threat directed at your very identity can have a profound impact on your mental health.
Right. That makes sense. And it highlights how important it is to understand the different ways trauma can manifest and provide support that's tailored to those specific experiences.
Absolutely. Recognizing these nuances is essential for effective treatment and recovery.
So we've established that the Syrian refugee crisis has resulted in incredibly high rates of mental health needs. I'm guessing that despite the immense need, there are also significant barriers to getting help.
Unfortunately, you're right. The review points out that many Syrian refugees are not receiving any mental health support at all.
That's incredibly concerning. What are some of the reasons behind this lack of access?
Well, there are a number of factors at play. Some relate to resource limitations. There simply aren't enough trained mental health professionals or clinics available in many areas,
Oh.
especially in countries already struggling to cope with the influx of refugees.
And are there other factors aside from just not enough therapists available that are keeping people from getting the help they need?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. On top of all that, you have the more systemic and cultural barriers to mental health care that we see all around the world. But these barriers are even more pronounced for refugees. Things like stigma surrounding mental illness, language barriers, even just a lack of awareness about mental health resources in their new communities.
It's a lot to navigate on top of everything else they're going through. It kind of makes you feel helpless just hearing about it.
Right, yeah.
But I guess that's why we're doing this deep dive to understand the problem so we can start thinking about solutions. So what does this review suggest as a starting point?
Well, first and foremost, the authors emphasize the need for more research, particularly longitudinal studies, because most of the data we have now comes from studies that were conducted at a single point in time, while the conflict and the displacement were still ongoing.
Which makes sense given the circumstances. But what's the downside of relying mainly on that kind of data?
Well, it's hard to separate situational distress, which is a perfectly normal response to extreme circumstances, from actual mental disorders that might require more long-term treatment. Longitudinal studies would allow researchers to track changes in mental health over time and get a clearer picture of the long-term impact of this crisis.
So more research is crucial to really understanding the scope of the problem. But what about practical solutions on the ground? What can be done right now to help Syrian refugees who are struggling?
Well, increasing access to mental health services is obviously a top priority. But it's not just about creating more clinics or training more therapists. It's about ensuring that those services are culturally sensitive and tailored to the unique needs of this population.
Because therapy isn't one size fits all, right? What works for someone in one culture might not resonate with someone from a completely different background.
Exactly. That's why culturally adapted therapies are so important. These are therapies that have been specifically designed to take into account the beliefs, values, and experiences of different cultural groups.
Yeah, I can see how that would be crucial in building trust and rapport, especially with a population that's already experienced so much trauma and displacement.
Yes, and it's not just about adapting the therapeutic techniques, it's also about overcoming language barriers and addressing the stigma surrounding mental health that might exist within certain communities.
It's a multifaceted approach, for sure. And while expanding mental health services is essential, it's probably not enough on its own. We also need to think about addressing those post-migration stressors we talked about earlier.
Absolutely. Creating welcoming and supportive environments in host countries is essential for helping refugees rebuild their lives and improve their mental well-being.
So what does that look like in practice?
Well, it's about providing refugees with the resources and support they need to integrate and thrive. Things like language classes, job training programs, and affordable housing can make a huge difference. It also means actively combating discrimination and promoting social inclusion, so refugees feel truly welcomed and valued in their new communities.
So it's not just about meeting basic needs, it's about fostering a sense of belonging. That must be incredibly important for someone who's been forced to leave everything behind.
It is. And on top of that, there's been a lot of emphasis on building resilience, both within refugee communities themselves and in the broader society.
I love that resilience is such a powerful concept.
It really is. It's about more than just bouncing back from adversity. It's about growing stronger through those experiences.
And that's what we want for these refugees, right?
Yeah.
Not just for them to survive, but to actually flourish.
Mhm.
What are some ways we can foster that resilience?
There are a number of approaches. For example, we can strengthen social support networks within refugee communities so people feel connected and supported by others who understand what they're going through. We can also promote mental health literacy so people know how to recognize the signs of mental distress and where to seek help. And perhaps most importantly, we can empower refugee communities to have a voice in decisions that affect them, give them a sense of agency and control over their own lives.
Yeah, that last point is so important. It's about recognizing the expertise and strength within these communities and giving them a seat at the table. Instead of just treating them as passive recipients of aid, we need to view them as partners in finding solutions.
Absolutely. And involving refugees in the design and implementation of programs is not only ethically sound, but it also makes those programs more likely to be effective and sustainable in the long run.
Okay, so we've talked about the need for more research, for expanding access to culturally sensitive mental health care, and for creating truly supportive environments for refugees in host countries. It feels like a lot to tackle. What can individuals listening to this do to make a difference? I mean, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the scale of the problem.
You're right. It is a complex issue, but there's a lot that individuals can do. Even small actions can have a ripple effect. For starters, simply educating yourself about the Syrian refugee crisis and the challenges they face is incredibly valuable. Knowledge is power, and understanding the nuances of the situation is the first step toward taking meaningful action.
I love that becoming informed is a form of activism. Do you have any recommendations for where people can find reliable information about the crisis and what's being done to address it?
Absolutely. There are so many great organizations doing incredible work on the ground and advocating for the rights and well-being of refugees. Organizations like the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, the International Rescue Committee, IRC, and Doctors Without Borders, MSF, all have websites with a wealth of information. They also offer opportunities to get involved in various ways.
Perfect. We'll be sure to link to those in the show notes for this episode so people can easily find them. What about for those who want to get involved in a more hands-on way?
Volunteering your time is a fantastic way to make a direct impact. Many local organizations working with refugees rely heavily on volunteers to provide a wide range of services.
So what kind of things could someone volunteer to do?
Oh, there are so many options. You could help with things like language tutoring, providing transportation, sorting donations, or even just offering a friendly face and a listening ear. Even a few hours a week can make a huge difference in the life of a refugee.
That's so true. And I imagine for people who might not have a lot of free time to give donations are always welcome.
Yes, financial contributions are always needed and appreciated. They allow these organizations to provide essential services like food, shelter, medical care, and mental health support. And don't underestimate the power of small donations. Every little bit adds up and can make a real difference.
I think people often feel like their small contribution won't matter, but that's definitely not true when it comes to supporting these kinds of efforts.
Exactly. Every dollar, every hour, every act of kindness has a ripple effect. And beyond financial contributions, there are also more creative ways to get involved.
Like what? What are some examples?
Well, if you have any special skills like photography or web design, you could offer those services to refugee organizations to help them with their outreach or fundraising efforts. Or if you're an artist or musician, you could organize a fundraiser or performance to benefit a refugee support group.
Those are fantastic ideas. It's a great reminder that we all have something unique to offer, and even our passions and hobbies can be used to support a cause we believe in.
Yes, and sometimes the most impactful actions are the ones that come from the heart.
It's so true. And I think another important way to support refugees, even if you can't donate money or volunteer your time, is to be an advocate within your own community.
That's a really crucial point. You can help shift the narrative around refugees simply by speaking up against discrimination and prejudice.
Because unfortunately, that's still a major problem, even in countries that are accepting refugees.
Yes, sadly it is. So challenging negative stereotypes and promoting understanding can go a long way in creating a more welcoming and inclusive society.
Because at the end of the day, this is about remembering our shared humanity, right? These are people just like us with hopes, dreams, and families they love. They've just been through incredibly difficult experiences that most of us can't even begin to imagine.
Exactly. They're not statistics or headlines. They're individuals who have been forced to flee their homes and rebuild their lives in unfamiliar places. And they deserve our compassion, our support, and our respect.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started by exploring the devastating mental health impacts of the Syrian refugee crisis, breaking down those shocking statistics, and getting a glimpse into the trauma that so many are carrying.
And from there, we moved into examining solutions both on a systemic level and what individuals like you can do to make a difference.
We've covered a lot of heavy stuff, but I hope you're walking away from this episode not just with a deeper understanding of the crisis, but also with a sense of hope and a desire to get involved.
We all have a role to play in creating a more compassionate and welcoming world for refugees.
So before we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final thought, something to ponder as we all move forward. We've talked about the steps host countries and individuals can take. But what about the bigger picture?
Yeah, I think that's a crucial question to consider. What can the international community as a whole do to address the root causes of displacement and prevent these kinds of crises from happening in the first place?
Yeah, it's so easy to get caught up in addressing those immediate needs. But if we don't tackle the underlying issues that force people to flee their homes in the first place, we're really just putting a Band-Aid on a much deeper wound.
You're exactly right. We can't ignore that bigger picture. Preventing future crises means investing in things like conflict resolution, promoting human rights, and tackling global inequality. These are complex long-term challenges, but they're essential if we want to create a world where everyone has the opportunity to live in peace and security.
It makes you realize that this isn't just about helping refugees, it's about building a more just and equitable world for everyone.
Absolutely. Investing in peace, human rights, and sustainable development is not only the right thing to do morally, it's also in everyone's best interest in the long run.
So this deep dive has really taken us on a journey. We started by exploring the devastating mental health impacts of the Syrian refugee crisis, breaking down those shocking statistics and getting a glimpse into the trauma that so many are carrying.
And from there, we moved into examining solutions, both on a systemic level and what individuals like you can do to make a difference.
We've covered a lot of heavy stuff today, but I hope you're walking away from this episode not just with a deeper understanding of the crisis, but also with a sense of hope and a desire to get involved.
We all have a role to play in creating a more compassionate and welcoming world for refugees.
So keep learning, keep engaging, and keep advocating for a better future. Until next time.